Would have been okay, so today we're going to continue with our study of the reproductive system. Right? When we left off, we were talking about the ovarian cycle. Okay. So we talked about the fact that we have changes in hormonal development and physical characteristics throughout the lifespan. We know that ova begin meiosis really during fetal life, or they undergo this period of meiotic arrest, where they're waiting inside the ovaries for ovulation to occur before actually beginning meiosis 1. We mentioned that we have 2 different subcycles, an ovarian cycle, so that's going to concern eggs and their release and some hormones. And we're also going to go over the uterine cycle today. Overall, this cycle is driven by changes in estrogen and progesterone. So we started by breaking out the ovarian cycle. So day 1 of the ovarian cycle actually begins during menstruation. The follicular phase lasts until ovulation, which happens at about day 14. Then we continue into the luteal phase. So the second half of the cycle is characterized by the fact that the remnants of our developing follicle stay within the ovary and basically become a gland that then degenerates. Okay. So we looked through that. Since these explanations, I think were a little bit confusing last time, I'm going to review this just by going through the pictures, specifically the follicular phase. You do have a separate file of the slides I'm going over. It's just a picture I'm walking through that you already have. But if you want these later, you got them. Okay. So we're thinking about going through the follicular phase and then into the luteal phase. So we're thinking about this first part from day 1, beginning of menstruation to ovulation. Okay. So if we're looking at an ovary, look at an ovary. Okay. So we're starting out with our primordial follicles. All right, I circled these for myself. We're starting out with our primordial follicles, which already exist within the ovary, already are there since birth. Okay. So within that primordial follicle, we have a little developing oocyte in the center. So our egg cell is in the center. And we have a layer of follicle cells surrounding it. Okay. So this follicle is going to grow and develop over the course of the follicular phase. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So as it develops into a primary follicle, we start to have these things differentiate. So we'd see more terms, basically. So we still have that oocyte in the center, but those follicle cells have developed, and now we have a bunch of stuff kind of around here. Okay, most important, or the first kind of to appear, are going to be the granulosa cells. Okay. And then those granulosa cells are going to add on a layer called the zona pellucida surrounding that oocyte, and a layer outside the theca cells. Okay. So these would all be involved basically in producing and receiving hormones. We're going to talk generalizations when we talk about hormonal control, but this is ultimately where receptors and stuff are going to be. We're not going to go too far into those details. So then once we can see an antrum, that's called a secondary follicle. That antrum is basically filled with fluid that's going to surround eventually that developing oocyte. Yeah, this is the point at which you could kind of count follicles if you did a scan of someone's ovary, once it gets kind of this big, okay? Or preferably this big. Okay, so a mature follicle is called a Graafian follicle. We can see that that antrum is real big, right? And we can see that there's a layer kind of left around the developing oocyte called the corona radiata that at ovulation is breaking off along with the oocyte. Everything else from that ruptured follicle stays behind. So those structures that are the remnants of those theca cells, the granulosa cells, et cetera, are staying within the ovary. So here we see that antrum breaking and releasing our little oocyte, and the corona radiata still surrounding it. Okay. And all this stuff that's left becomes the corpus luteum, which is why our luteal phase is called our luteal phase. So this would be then the luteal phase. We have this corpus luteum. It's going to be producing some hormones, estrogens and progesterone, and then it's going to degenerate. And the drop in hormones ultimately is going to cause menstruation. So we can see it becoming the corpus albicans at the end here. So that's kind of an overview of that big wall of text from last time. So that ovulation is occurring at the end of the follicular phase around day 14. This is when meiosis 1 would occur. And I think even the beginning of meiosis 2 maybe begins, but that doesn't really continue until after fertilization. We're going to get to hormonal control, but ovulation ultimately is going to be a response to the surge in a hormone called LH, luteinizing hormone. Okay, so that's what's going on in the ovaries, but changes to the uterus are also important. So we're going to have layers to the uterus and what's going on with the production of glands, the degree of vascularity, so how much blood flow is there in the uterus, as well as the lining of the uterus is going to change throughout this roughly monthly cycle. So it's going to pair up kind of, but instead of having just 2 phases, we now have 3. So we need to stack them upon each other. Okay, so if we divide our ovarian phase or our ovarian cycle into a follicular phase and a luteal phase, right? So let's say follicular, luteal in the ovary. This is in an image that you have stacking everything together, right? But I'm just putting it on here while we're talking about it. So follicular phase and luteal phase, midpoint is ovulation around day 14. Okay, the uterine cycle is going to get put there in 3. So we're going to have both the menstrual phase at the beginning of that follicular phase. So in your uterus, the first thing that's happening is actually a shedding of the lining. So that would be the bleeding part of the menstrual cycle, days 1 through 5. And then following that, up until ovulation, we're going to have the proliferative phase. So we're going to have structures within the uterus proliferating, so growing, expanding. We're getting more of these things during the proliferative phase. And then in the luteal phase after ovulation, we're going to start secreting a bunch of stuff. So that's the secretory phase for the entire luteal phase here. So the part with it we've broken up really is that follicular phase of the ovary contains both the menstrual phase and this proliferative phase. So when we are looking at the uterus, draw us a little uterus. Okay. So most of it's made up of muscle. And here I'm drawing a cervix. Okay. So it's kind of hollow. Okay. It's got walls made of muscle, but it also has a lining. Okay. So during this first part of the uterine cycle, what we're thinking about is that lining of the wall. Okay. So we have parts of the wall itself here, the endometrial thickness. So the endometrium, right, is inside the uterus. The muscle part would be called the myometrium, myo for muscle. Okay, so we're looking at this inner layer of the uterus right now. Okay. So during menstruation, parts of this lining, the inner parts of this uterine lining, are going to basically fall off, right? So we're causing this tissue to kind of slough off and exit the body, basically. So this is the dying off of this tissue. And then ultimately throughout the cycle, it's going to be renewed. Okay. So this is partially happening because overall blood flow to the tissue is decreasing. So you can see we don't have as many little blood vessels here as we're going to have later on during the secretory phase. So those tissues are dying off because of a decrease in hormones and this decrease in blood flow, causing menstrual flow, which is this tissue shedding into the vagina and out of the body. Okay. So this is going to be triggered by decreasing levels of estrogen and progesterone, which during the second half of the menstrual cycle, so during that luteal phase, have been coming from that corpus luteum. Okay, so that corpus luteum is a gland. It's been producing these hormones. And as it's dying off here, we're going to see dropping levels of estrogen and progesterone, okay, which causes this sort of die off of the tissue. Okay. So that's the menstrual phase. Then we're going to go into the proliferative phase. So after about day 5, we're done shedding that lining, and the uterus is going to start to regenerate parts of this tissue. So it's preparing for ovulation at day 14, which is roughly when the body would expect that fertilization may happen. So it's going to be preparing for possible fertilization. Okay. So this means that the endometrium, that lining inside the uterus, is expanding. Okay, so it's getting thicker. At the end of menstruation, it's kind of thinned out here. Okay. It's going to create more of a lining kind of here, right? So it's all kind of growing. You can see that this section is really proliferating. Okay. Glands within this tissue are going to get larger. I don't think they're really pictured here. A layer of smooth muscle is going to get thicker. And glands in the cervix are going to secrete like a thin mucus. So the cervix, I'm going to draw uterus again. Okay, so the cervix is this lower third of the uterus, essentially. Going to be the cavity. And there's our cervix down here at the bottom. Okay. So the cervix specifically also has glands. They're secreting thin mucus at this point that kind of potentially aids movement of sperm. Okay. So the hormonal control here is coming from estrogens. And these estrogens are not at this point coming from that corpus albicans and that generating tissue. At this point, they're going to be coming from the growing follicles. So we're going to have multiple places that we get estrogen from. And I'll tie it all together when we look at graphs, essentially, of our hormones. Okay. So these estrogens, increasing levels of estrogens, are causing us to grow this endometrial lining. After ovulation happens, okay, so we've released an ovum into the fallopian tubes. It's caught by these little finger-like projections called fimbriae, going through the uterine tube. Okay. Once that's happening, your uterus is going to further continue to change, potentially waiting for, if that ovum gets fertilized, preparing for implantation of a fertilized egg cell. Okay, so blood supply is continuing to increase even more. Okay, so we're increasing blood supply even more. The glands here are secreting an even thicker, they're starting to get even larger, and they're secreting a glycogen-rich fluid at this point. So glycogen, we remember, is basically a bunch of glucose monomers all linked together. So that glycogen could start to feed a growing embryo potentially, right? And the cervical secretions, so from that lower third of the uterus, cervix, they're going to get more sticky. So this is a difference from the proliferative phase, right? A lot of what's happening during the secretory phase is just kind of extension. It's continuing to grow larger. Okay, but those cervical secretions now are going to be stickier. They're going to form a plug. That's because ovulation has already occurred. So if fertilization is going to happen, It will also really have already happened at the start of this secretory phase. And egg cell is only viable for like 12 hours to 24 hours, right? So if fertilization is happening, it's happened from, like right here, pretty much right after ovulation. So these cervical secretions are kind of plugging over the cervix to kind of protect potentially from infection if pregnancy does happen. Okay, so then we would start over. So we can see this all mapped on together here. So here we have the events of our ovary. This is just a picture from your book. All right, so we're looking at a picture of the ovary, of those follicles growing. Okay. And here we see that tissue in the uterus. Okay. And these two cycles together are happening at once. Okay. So we can see that as that follicle is growing, okay, first, we're just kind of finishing out what's happening in reaction to our little gland there dying off. And then we're starting to grow back up again during the proliferative phase. After ovulation, we have the secretory phase. Once our gland degenerates, everything kind of starts over. We decrease that endometrial thickness. We shed that inner uterine lining and then begin to grow again. Okay. So the menstrual cycle is controlled really by hormones. So hormones are coming from the structures within the reproductive tract, but they are also responding to these hormonal changes. Okay? And this is also why we see changes over the lifespan in response to changes in hormone levels. Okay. So we have two places we can get our main hormone estrogen. Okay. So the first place we're going to get estrogen from is from our growing follicles within the ovary, right? So that little primordial follicle that then gets bigger, right? And bigger until it's a mature Graafian follicle, okay? So that is initially going to be helping us secrete estrogen, okay? So we can see as that follicle gets bigger, our estrogen levels are going up, okay? Once ovulation occurs and that follicle bursts, while it's no longer producing estrogens, we're going to have a drop in estrogen for a little bit, but then it's going to get taken over essentially by actions from the corpus luteum. Okay, so you can see during that luteal phase, we then have estrogens rise again before they drop off as that corpus luteum dies. Okay. So that's what's going on with the estrogen. Okay. Now we have another hormone we're interested in, which is progesterone. So progesterone is only coming from the corpus luteum. So it's not coming from the follicles. So our progesterone levels throughout the follicular phase, you can see here, are down on our axis, right? They're pretty much zero here. Okay. The time we see progesterone is during that luteal phase, as our corpus luteum is producing them until it starts to die off, at which point we see those progesterone levels drop. Okay. Now, those are the hormones that are coming essentially from our ovary and the cells within our ovary, but we also have signals coming from out in your body, specifically really from our anterior pituitary gland, okay? So remember our anterior pituitary gland, we got our brain, we got our hypothalamus, going down into our pituitary gland, not to scale, obviously. We have an anterior and a posterior part. We had a portal system between them. Okay, so we're thinking about hormones coming from here, the anterior pituitary. So that's where our LH and FSH come from. All right. So these are hormones, right? This is part of our endocrine system. They're getting secreted from the anterior pituitary, getting into your bloodstream, traveling all the way around the body, okay? So they are going to get to the ovary, just like they're getting everywhere else because there's blood flow, okay? So they are going to be triggering basically ovulation. So they're going to be triggering this kind of change. So you can see that a spike in LH and also a little spike in FSH, but LH is really the important one here. The spike in LH is directly preceding this switch from our follicular phase to our luteal phase. So the spike in LH, this huge increase in this hormone, is what triggers ovulation. So that's what triggers the bursting of that mature follicle, that Graafian follicle, and the release of the egg to get caught by the fimbriae, the fallopian tube, the uterine tube, etc. Okay. Now, that spike is partially a spike because it goes way, way up and then way, way down. Otherwise, we just call it like a rise and it would just kind of sit there. So as in the luteal phase, that corpus luteum is releasing more estrogen and progesterone. This suppresses that LH and FSH. So we can see that the LH and FSH during that luteal phase are low. Okay. So we're going to walk through what is happening during the different parts of the menstrual cycle. Yeah. So from the hypothalamus, from that little part of our brain, right, we do have a hormone at the first part of that portal system that we mentioned when we were doing endocrine stuff. So we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, and that's what's signaling the anterior pituitary to make follicle stimulating hormone, which is the long name for FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which is our LH. So these are what's coming out of our anterior pituitary. So these are what's going to get into our bloodstream and signal to the ovaries. Okay. So these hormones are going down to the ovaries. They're going different places, but essentially they're going to parts of that follicle. Okay. So two parts of that follicle are the theca cells and the granulosa cells. Okay. We have two things going on here. Okay. So we're going to track what's going on with the FSH on this side first. Okay. So that FSH going to our granulosa cells. Okay. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. Okay. So this is really part of why those follicles are growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Right. Those are the follicles that make this FSH stimulating. So they're growing hormone because it's a hormone, travels far through the body. Okay. So this is causing oogenesis and that development of the follicle here. Okay. Now with the LH, we're going to travel through the other side now. So our other hormone coming from the anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone, okay, has a slightly longer pathway. And I don't really need you to know the different steps until we get to the end effect here, but I'm going to walk through them anyway. Okay. So the theca cells actually initially make androgens, which may surprise you, but androgens can be converted into estrogen. Okay. So this is part of why we said that all people are really going to have kind of levels of both androgens and estrogen, right? Because of this sort of conversion ability. Okay. So androgen secretion is coming from those theca cells. It gets modified by the granulosa cells and causes the production of estrogen. Okay. So that's what we mean when we say our follicles are producing estrogen, right? That's part of it. Okay. So that estrogen is increasing, which is helping with that development of the follicles. It's also swirling around into our bloodstream. Okay. Now, the final part of this drawing is that we have negative feedback loops. So as our plasma estrogen levels get higher, they do have negative feedback on the LH secretion and on our initial trigger up here, the gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion from the hypothalamus. And this additional hormone inhibin is inhibiting follicle stimulating hormone. Right. So here are some descriptions of some of the actions of the estrogens that we're producing here. Their actions throughout the follicular phase, as well as through pregnancy and during the luteal phase. But we weren't done yet. So and draw our little graph on the side while we're doing this. So before we were looking at the early and mid follicular phase. So we had started out with our estrogen that was increasing, right, having a kind of rise prior to ovulation and then falling a bit again. Sorry. Okay, so we had gotten through that parts of that rise essentially, right? So we know that it's starting to be released by those follicles, right? We don't have to worry about progesterone during the follicular phase. That's only during the luteal phase. So the other thing we were thinking about is that we had a little bit of a rise in LH and FSH, but we don't have a spike yet. So not a ton was happening there. We might see like a little bit of a rise. Let's make it a little more like this. Okay, cool. So we do have more reactions in the late follicular phase as we're approaching ovulation. So during the late follicular phase, the gonadotropin releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus is going to cause even more of a release of LH and FSH. That's its job. But at this point, the granulosa cells are secreting a bunch of estrogen. Okay? So estrogen secretion is increasing as we move forward here. Okay? And this creates a positive feedback loop during the late follicular phase. Okay? So this positive feedback loop is causing that LH spike just prior to ovulation. Okay. And here are the actions of progesterone that then comes during the luteal phase. So during the luteal phase is when we have a lot of this negative feedback happening. Okay, so we have negative feedback happening, but our corpus luteum, our gland, is taking over production of estrogen and progesterone. So we start to see those levels rise again. They're just coming from a new spot, increasing levels of plasma estrogen and plasma progesterone. So that's how we get to, I'm going to flip back to our total graph. So that's how we get to this picture, right? So our follicles are essentially producing estrogen and progesterone up until, or sorry, they're producing estrogen, but not progesterone up until ovulation. During this later part of the follicular phase, we have positive feedback. So this goes up really quickly. At the same time, our LH is going up. Okay. Our FSH goes up a little bit, gets suppressed a little bit, then goes up a lot more in the late follicular phase. That's what's feeding those growing follicles. That surge dies off during the luteal phase. And we have estrogen and progesterone not being very high right after ovulation, but as that corpus luteum takes over production, it's producing estrogen again, but it really, really produces a bunch of progesterone, which we haven't seen during the first part of this cycle. Questions about this process? All right, so that's what's going on. We do overall have changes throughout the lifespan that are related to these hormones. So specifically to estrogen. So estrogen rises and especially rises during puberty. So this is what produces secondary sex characteristics like widening of hips, the development of breasts, larger hips, larger buttocks, the production of skin oil, body hair changes, and additional growth of bones. So a growth spurt, essentially, is a response to increasing levels of hormones, specifically here estrogen. During the reproductive years, estrogen levels are going to stay high to maintain these characteristics, but also because we have a fully functioning menstrual cycle going on, we're producing estrogen with those follicles as well as with our corpus luteum. Okay. But at menopause, we see a decrease in these estrogen levels. So we're kind of bookending the reproductive years with low levels of estrogen, which means that we have the reversal of some secondary sex characteristics. So we have like body changes. This is also part of what causes hot flashes during menopause. And there are also changes to disease risk associated with changes to these hormone levels. So things like heart disease and osteoporosis also become more prevalent after menopause. So sometimes to decrease some of these side effects, I guess, of dropping estrogen, supplementary estrogen can be prescribed to kind of help out. All right, so we're next going to take a look at fertilization and how this is going to look different if we do fertilize that ovum after ovulation. Okay, so I'm going to just run through this picture real quick first. All right, so here we can see that growth of our follicle, so that follicular phase, and we can see the release of our ovum during ovulation. We would still form a corpus luteum, and usually this would degenerate if we don't have a fertilization event. If we do have fertilization, what has happened is that ovum has gotten caught by our fimbriae. Those are those little fingery processes here. Okay, so we had fluid movement moving that egg cell into the uterine tube. Okay, so we're here at the beginning of our uterine tube. It's really right kind of at the beginning where we would meet up with sperm cells. So they're swimming towards that ovum and potentially fertilizing that egg cell. Okay, so once we have a fertilized ovum, we produce what we call a zygote. So now we would have both information from the sperm cell and the egg cell in the center here. We're keeping some of those tissues that were around the edge here. You can see that zona pellucida is still there. And then that fertilized egg cell starts to divide. Okay, so it divides in half and then half again, giving us 4 cells. And then continues dividing, getting bigger. At 3 to 4 days, we'd call it a morula. Then 4 to 5 days, it's starting to kind of separate into different spaces. This is a blastocyst, and it's implanting in the wall of the uterus. So here we can see it attaching to that lining of the uterus. Okay, so that's implantation. We can see those cells that have clumped up are kind of nearest that uterine wall. You can see that they're next to a little gland here. Okay. And we can see that that is then starting to kind of grow into the wall of the uterus. It's starting to form an amniotic cavity, and these structures will develop and continue throughout pregnancy, essentially. Yeah. So like I said, there are lots of words associated with embryology. This is not an embryology course, but this is kind of what would happen. Yeah. So yeah, and that's all just 6 days post-fertilization. Okay. So fertilization doesn't actually take place in the uterus itself. Fertilization is going to take place usually in the uterine tube, so out in the fallopian tubes, and usually pretty close to the ovary. So usually kind of in the like ampulla area. Okay. So the sperm have to get there. They have to swim there. So a true fact about sperm and egg cells are sperm are viable for like 5 days, but the oocyte is only viable for less than a day, pretty much 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so they have different lifespans essentially, which if you think about the sperm, right, we know they've been hanging out in the testes waiting to develop and gain motility for like 28 days. You know, they were waiting out at the base of the urethra to be ejaculated, right? They've been waiting, so maybe it's not so surprising that they can live for longer. Okay, so this means that if we're thinking about that ovarian cycle, okay, in our ovary, we had that follicular phase at the beginning, then we had our luteal phase for the second half, day 14 is ovulation, our central point. We've only got like 12 to 24 hours in the center here for fertilization to occur. Okay, it's not very long. So that means that usually if fertilization is happening, the sperm is deposited before ovulation or like right then. So like up to 5 days before. All right, so if sperm is deposited like day 9, 10, etc., that sperm is there as time to swim through the cervix, swim through the uterus, swim up the uterine tube, and it's not dead for 5 days. So if it's there hanging out waiting when the ovum is released, when ovulation occurs, then fertilization is likely to occur or can occur, right? So this is kind of the window for fertilization. So before and up until ovulation, and then up to like 24 hours after ovulation. If we don't have it in that window, these tissues, the sperm and the oocyte, are non-viable. They're gonna just like die off, degenerate. Okay. When we start out with our sperm, they are not capable of fertilization, actually. So they have to go and undergo an additional developmental process called capacitation. So they're building the capacity to fertilize an egg cell. And this usually occurs within the female reproductive tract. So what's happening there is the sperm is really developing its ability to swim faster, essentially, changes tail movements, that kind of stuff. It usually happens after ejaculation in the female reproductive tract. Okay. So it's swimming up potentially 5 days before ovulation, trying to get up towards the ovary. At ovulation, the oocyte gets released by the ovary, has to float a little bit to get to the fimbriae of the uterine tube. So we have some fluid movement pushing it forward. And if the sperm are there, may meet up with them, fertilization may occur. Okay. So that process has to do with peristaltic contractions a little bit. So we have the oocyte moving towards the uterus for a little bit as those uterine tubes contract, kind of move everything forward. And then we start to have cilia, so ciliated cells, so little like hair cells that can move the oocyte towards the uterus continuously until it eventually gets to the uterus after a couple days. That whole trip down the uterine tube takes about 4 days. Okay, so the sperm are going to meet the ovum, if they're going to meet the ovum, sometime along that process, and it usually does happen out near the ovary, out in those initial portions, because of that viability of the oocyte, which is pretty short. Okay. So there are lots and lots of sperm. So many chances, many of them trying to fertilize the egg cell. So millions of them, literally. They're swimming to the uterus, and then they're swimming up and out the uterine tube. So we know we have, so cervix, then we got uterus. Oops. And it's got its little horns, our uterine tubes, and those fimbriae. And excuse my bad drawings, as usual. And then we're kind of like cupping the ovary, which is separate. Okay. So they're swimming to the uterus and the uterine tube. Survival time there is about 5 days. They don't all get there, right? We start out with millions of sperm, but they need to undergo capacitation to be able to swim fast and far enough. Only a few hundred get to the uterine tubes. If capacitation doesn't happen, the sperm aren't going to be able to fertilize the oocyte. That's because there are also alterations basically to the plasma membrane of the sperm. Okay. If we do have fertilization, what's happening, our picture, right, is we have an egg cell. That sperm is entering through the outer layer here of our follicle. That's zona pellucida, right? There. And once one of them enters, this sends off the release of enzymes, hormones, stuff that basically kill off the other maybe 100 sperm that have reached this same area, because if we had another sperm also fertilize, we'd end up with too many chromosomes, which would not form a viable fetus or embryo. Okay. So the part I added today, if you guys saw my announcement, if not, don't worry, you do have these slides. They're just updated. It's about birth control because I think this helps highlight some of the parts of these processes. And also it's just important to know for life, and especially if there's going to be a healthcare provider, how this stuff actually works. Okay, so it is tricky. We're not going to go through all the details of every single option because there are so many different options, but we're going to go through some generalizations and where they trigger like different, or where they prevent different parts of this process, basically. So we can prevent fertilization and pregnancy by preventing different parts of this stuff, right? So one thing we can do is just block sperm, right? Sperm can't get through the cervix, can't get into the uterus, can't get up into the uterine tube, or, right, if capacitation hasn't worked, they're not able to fertilize an egg cell, we're not going to have a pregnancy occur. Another very common thing we can do, we'll see a lot of the methods involve this, is we can prevent ovulation. So if the ovary never releases an egg cell, there's no egg cell there to be fertilized, so pregnancy would not occur. We can also just damage sperm, right? They have to travel up the uterine tubes kind of to get to the egg cell before it becomes non-viable. They only have so long to do that. So if you mess with them, mess with that tail, make it so that they can't swim to the egg, likely also prevents pregnancy. Another method of blocking sperm and their journey to an egg cell is by changing the cervical mucus. And this is kind of separate by this is related to this first bullet point, but this is usually going to happen through hormonal mechanisms, right? Rather than being like a barrier method. But if we make that cervical mucus really thick and sticky, like we see during the secretory phase, right? This can block that sperm from entering through the cervix. So it doesn't get into the uterus, doesn't get into the uterine tube, doesn't get to an egg cell, even if ovulation occurs. And finally, we could change the uterine lining. We could change parts of that implantation. And if we were to make it such that a fertilized egg cell can't implant, then pregnancy would also not occur because that fertilized egg cell would just pass out of the body the way that they normally do during menstruation. Okay. So we have a number of different sort of categories of birth control. The first and most effective is sterilization, which sounds scary, but these procedures are common. So like a vasectomy, where we cut the vas deferens or block it, is a common method of male birth control. Actually, these are reversible in many cases. Okay, so this is a pretty easy procedure because the testes hang within the scrotum outside the body, so it's not very invasive. You only have to get right there. Okay. So if you cut or block that tube, then we can't have those sperm that are being produced in the testes, right? They could get into the epididymis, they could get into the base of the vas deferens, but they're not going to continue out, and ultimately they're not going to be expelled during ejaculation. Ejaculation would just be our various fluids coming from glands at that point. So pregnancy would not occur if there's no sperm in the ejaculate. No. We have an analogous procedure in female anatomy. So a tubal ligation involves cutting or blocking the uterine tubes. Okay. So this is a more invasive procedure because you have to get physically into the pelvis because that's where the uterine tubes are. It can be done. All right. Next, we have barrier methods. So barrier methods are physically putting a block between the sperm and the egg cell. So that would include condoms of various types, as well as things that block the cervix, like diaphragms, sponges, or cervical caps. Okay, so these are different ways you can kind of block the sperm from traveling out the penis and into the cervix, ultimately into the uterus, up into the uterine tube. All right, so we're going to spend a little time thinking about, so we can pinpoint parts of our ovarian cycle specifically, is thinking about hormonal methods. Okay, so hormonal methods are going to include like birth control pills taken during the menstrual cycle, as well as longer acting hormonal contraceptive methods like hormonal IUDs or copper IUDs, which are non-hormonal, would kind of count because they're long acting. We also have shots, implants, patches, and rings, which function in similar or analogous ways. Okay. And actually, we can talk about the function at the beginning of Wednesday. We got 2 minutes. I'll keep this topic kind of all together. Okay.